And we'll start with Inspector General Horowitz. You may proceed.
I'm sorry, couldn't hear.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There you go. It was calling on me first.
It's here. Yes, it is. Thank you.
Perfect. Appreciate it. Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and thank you to members of this committee for holding today's important hearing. I also want to acknowledge with me are the team that worked on the deaths in custody report and went to visit sites, including USP Thompson, the prison that you mentioned in your opening statement. I've been Inspector General now for almost 12 years, and every year I've included the BOP in my annual report of the top management and performance challenges facing the Department of Justice. Yet, with some notable exceptions, the problems at the BOP seem to only increase. Indeed, last year, the BOP was added to the GAO's high-risk list. To be clear, these are not new problems. Indeed, yesterday we released a compendium of over 100 publicly issued OIG reports since 2002, reflecting the systemic challenges at the BOP that we've identified over the past 2 decades. Many of the 344 deaths that you mentioned that we found were due to suicide, homicide, drug overdose, or other unknown factors that we reviewed in the deaths in custody report have a direct connection to these challenges. And by the way, as we reference in our report, so did the high-profile deaths of inmates Jeffrey Epstein in 2019 and James Whitey Bulger in 2018, as we detailed in those public reports that we issued. When the public wonders whether the treatment of those 2 high-profile inmates was unique, the answer, sadly, from our deaths in custody report is that it was not. Many of the 344 inmate deaths we discuss in the report were the result of similarly serious management and operational failures. These include long-standing management and operational challenges that involve serious staffing shortages, including for correctional and healthcare positions, single celling of inmates, inappropriate mental health care designations of inmates, ineffective contraband interdiction, an outdated camera security system, staff failure to follow BOP policies and procedures, and an ineffective, untimely staff disciplinary process. Indeed, one or more of these challenges was a contributing factor in many of the inmate deaths in our scope, and these long-standing challenges continue to present a significant and critical threat to the BOP's safe and humane management of inmates in its care and custody. For example, we found that in nearly 1/3 of the inmate deaths within our scope, contraband drugs or weapons contributed or appeared to contribute to the death. The rampant proliferation of contraband is a major challenge for the BOP, resulting in the BOP partially closing its federal penitentiary in Atlanta in 2021. And as our report notes, USP Atlanta had the highest number of deaths during the time period of our review. Ensuring that staff follows policies and procedures and are held accountable for serious wrongdoing is critical to improving the safety and security of BOP institutions for both inmates and the overwhelming majority of BOP employees who do their jobs with honesty and integrity. The OIG dedicates significant resources to investigate alleged criminal wrongdoing at BOP facilities, particularly sexual assault and contraband smuggling. As we've seen through our ongoing criminal investigation at FCI Dublin, where the warden, chaplain, and several other inmates have been convicted of sexual assault charges, failing to timely identify and address criminal wrongdoing can spiral and poison an institution's culture. Relatedly, our ongoing our audit of BOP's use of restraints was prompted in large part by allegations that inmates at USP Thompson, which you referenced, and their special management unit were routinely placing 4-point restraints for extended periods of time and were otherwise and that inmates were otherwise mistreated while restrained. This unit was recently closed by Director Peters in response to these and other concerns. Let me now turn to suicide, which comprised, as you noted, the majority of the deaths we reviewed. More than half of those who died by suicide, as you noted, were in single-cell confinement, despite BOP policy that strongly disfavors the use of single-celling. Further, almost half the suicides, as you noted, occurred in restrictive housing units. Moreover, over 60% of inmates who died by suicide had been designated at the lowest mental health treatment level. None of these are new issues, The OIG has repeatedly identified them in our prior reports, and the GAO has also raised them. We made 12 new recommendations in our death in custody report, and the BOP agreed with all of them, and we will carefully monitor the BOP's implementation of them. Effectively addressing these widespread systemic issues at the BOP requires a long-term vision and strategy from BOP and department leadership, with support from the Office of Management and Budget, the Congress, and other important stakeholders. To be clear, the problems we've identified in our oversight work over the past 20 years won't be solved overnight, but they must be addressed with urgency to protect the health, safety, and security of BOP staff and inmates, and to enable inmates to successfully return to our communities upon their release from prison. Toward that end, I very much have appreciated my quarterly meetings with Director Peters and her desire to meet with me regularly. It's the first time in my 12 years as IG where that's occurred, and we've, I think, made some important progress working together. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, General. Director Peters?
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, who's not with us today, and members of the committee. I am pleased to be here with you and Inspector General Horowitz to discuss the deaths in custody report. We welcome, agree with, and
would you pull the microphone just a little closer to you? Thank you.
Yes. We welcome, agree with, and are implementing the report's recommendations and have plans to go even further and take additional steps to mitigate unexpected deaths in custody. I have spent my entire professional career working in the public safety field, including as a victim advocate, working with victims who lost loved ones. I know any unexpected death of an adult in our care and custody is tragic, and it changes the lives of that person's family and loved ones forever. We also experience these deaths as a heavy blow. I have been in our institutions in the days following unexpected deaths, and I have seen our employees suffering due to the loss. Our core mission always is to care for those in our custody in hopes that they leave our facilities prepared to be good neighbors. When our best efforts are not successful and death does occur, we initiate review processes to understand the cause of these deaths so that we can prevent similar deaths going forward. But we can do better here and must ensure that our reviews go deep enough and our documentation is clear enough to support those reviews. Our psychological assessments conclude that many individuals who come to us come with mental illness and substance use disorders, making them more susceptible to suicide, overdose, and homicide. So to combat these deaths, we work on root causes and have incorporated evidence-based treatments like medication-assisted treatment. We train our employees to recognize those at risk of attempting suicide, refer at-risk people for help, and respond to suicide attempts, and also train on the appropriate use of CPR, AEDs, naloxone, and cut-down tools, ensuring our employees have access to those tools in the workplace. The report notes that suicides occurred when people were single-celled or in restrictive housing. That is why we now provide special training to those who work in restrictive housing and limit the use of single-celling. We have restrictive housing reforms underway now that will reduce the amount of time adults in custody spend in restrictive housing for disciplinary violations. We are creating a special post in restrictive housing to help those in custody transition from that restrictive housing environment to the general population. And we're going to add employees in restrictive housing during the overnight shift. We continuously work to combat contraband to reduce homicides and overdoses. This includes heightened screening of mail, detecting and intercepting drones, monitoring or terminating cellular communications, and continually monitoring intelligence and gang activity. To harness all of this intelligence, we are creating a new chief inspector position to identify system-wide patterns and problems, including that would prevent deaths in our custody. On a departmental level, the Deputy Attorney General has also formed a working group of experts to better prevent suicides. Again, I want to be perfectly clear. Our employees are our everything, and fully staffed institutions and well-trained employees save lives. Yet it is no secret that our agency is in crisis as it relates to recruitment and retention. We are aggressively recruiting and utilizing incentives to maintain the employees we have, and while our efforts over this past year have gleaned results, we are still faced with an inability to compete with the private sector and other law enforcement agencies. As an example, at a federal prison about an hour outside of Boston, a correctional officer recently quit his job for a better offer with better pay. The better offer? Working at the local grocery store. On the law enforcement side, an ad running in the New York City subway is advertising that city correctional officers can make around $130,000 after a few years on the job, while in the same amount of time, our officers, after we've implemented the 35% retention bonus, would be making about $90,000. The story is the same throughout the country. We need more resources to carry out our mission, implement our vision, and reach our goals. Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the committee, thank you once again for this opportunity to speak on behalf of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. My interest in this issue started many years ago when I read an article in the Atlantic magazine by Atul Gawande, a doctor in Boston, about the impact of isolation and solitary confinement on the human mind, not just in this correctional setting, but prisoners of war. He referenced our former colleague, John McCain, and what he went through after 5 years of that type of treatment and what impact it had on him. And Dr. Gawande, who now works for the USAID, reminded us that the majority of prisoners will ultimately be released. If they're damaged in the process of serving time in prison, they'll take that damage out into the open society and others may suffer. So this has been a long time issue. It's been 12 years since the first hearing under my leadership occurred in this committee. I voiced concerns over reliance on solitary confinement, pleaded with the directors now and before you to do something about it. I'm going to reintroduce my legislation, Solitary Confinement Reform Act, to limit the use of the practice. Director Peters, the latest statistics show that despite the decrease in Bureau of Prisons' total population since you were sworn in as director in August of 2022, the percentage and total of number of individuals in restricted housing is actually higher than it was at that time. As of this month, approximately 7.9%, or 11,179 people, are currently being held in some form of restrictive housing, an increase of 0.6% since September 2022. Director Peters, you previously pointed to your contract with the National Institute of Justice when asked about your plans to address restrictive housing. What is the status of that study?
Thank you, Senator. So the study is underway. NIJ has issued the contract. The individuals studying our restrictive housing have actually been on site and are visiting facilities, looking at our policies, our practices, and interviewing employees. We're also not just waiting for the results of that report. We're beginning to implement restrictive housing reform. Currently, we have plans to approve a new policy that will actually reduce the amount of time an individual can be sanctioned to restrictive housing for disciplinary purposes. As I mentioned in my opening comments, we're adding additional resources to solve this problem. And in the short term, as you well know in your very own state, we shut down the Special Management Unit in quick order last year.
Here's my concern. Since my first hearing on this issue in 2012, there have been multiple reviews of BOP policy. The latest came out earlier this month when the GAO published a report I requested. According to their report, BOP has not fully implemented 54 of the 87 recommendations from 2 prior studies on improving restrictive housing practices. One of those studies from 2014 was conducted by an external consultant. It made 34 recommendations, only 16 have been fully implemented. And a 2016 evaluation completed by the Department of Justice under the Obama administration, which President Biden ordered the Attorney General to implement in 2022, made 53 recommendations and only 17 have been implemented. The time for studies is over. The death rate in our prisons is unacceptable. Damage to mental health is unacceptable. My question to you is, what steps can you commit to today to immediately reduce restrictive housing populations?
Thank you, Senator. I think there are a variety of things that we're doing today, including approving that policy that's been long-standing negotiated with our national union, and that will decrease the amount of time that individuals can actually be sanctioned to restrictive housing for disciplinary purposes. The data also reveals that many of the individuals that are in restrictive housing are in there many times at their own choice because they fear their ability to walk in general population. So we are working on creating cultures and environments that are more normal and humane, so those individuals actually feel comfortable in general population. And then, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we're creating positions who will work in restrictive housing, and their sole responsibility will be working with those individuals who don't want to leave restrictive housing and help them transition into general population. We did this in the state of Oregon, and it was very successful, so we're looking forward to rolling that out this year. We're also looking at best practices across the country and around the globe to implement changes. As I shared with you the last time that we met, this last year has been filled with strategic planning for the department. We've rebooted our mission, our vision, our values, and many of the goals that we're working on will tie into restrictive housing, both a strong plan around restrictive housing reform and building morale and working on our recruitment and retention issues, which are at the core of many of the issues, as the Inspector General pointed out.
What percentage of people in restrictive housing volunteered to be in that housing?
That number is almost 40%, and we are looking at the data as we get even closer into the data. It might even be higher than that because we have individuals that are categorized as PC status, which falls into that 40%, but also individuals that are on transition status, and those too could fit into that category.
Aside from that category and those that are incarcerated because of their danger to other prisoners and cellmates, I'd like to ask you, do you accept the premise that those who are put in restrictive housing involuntarily run the very real risk of serious mental illness or worse?
Senator, I would argue that everyone who is in restrictive housing has will suffer from some form of mental or physical damage. I think even those that are agreeing or wanting to be in restrictive housing need to be educated on the fact that that isn't where they belong and that we need to be able to safely house them in GP. Just because they're volunteering to be there doesn't mean that the physical and mental wear and tear isn't happening for them as well. And I think that's what that position that we're wanting to create to put into restrictive housing will help combat. We also have reintegration units for those individuals where we actually have step-down programs and units that help people get out of restrictive housing, and we need to do better there as well.
Thank you. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you again. Always appreciate our conversations with you. I know our hearing today is focused on deaths of the incarcerated, but I want to change the topic just a little bit and look at the treatment of our BOP officers and focus on what is happening with some of the assaults against our staff, BOP staff, and not only the physical, but the PTSD and some of those issues that occur. And yesterday I introduced the Safer Prisons Act, which would double the maximum term of imprisonment for assaulting a BOP correctional officer. And Director Peters, for you, I know you'd agree that these assaults present a real danger for the Bureau of Prisons. So I'd like to have your support on the Safer Prisons Act and have you support doubling that maximum term.
Thank you, Senator. Well, you know there are processes with the Department of Justice in terms of component heads being able to support legislation, but I will tell you that the safety and security of our employees are essential. They are our everything. If they don't feel safe in our institutions, then we have lost the core of our mission.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned hiring and retention as an issue. Do you think the safety or the lack of safety and protection plays into that difficulty in hiring and retention?
I think that we do our best through augmentation and overtime in order to ensure that the posts that need to be filled are filled. But you and I have talked before, augmentation is a great resource in the short term, and we've been using it in the long term to solve a long-term recruitment and retention problem, and it is making our people exhausted. They are riveted with overtime. Augmentation impacts FSA programming and operations. Visiting is sometimes canceled because we don't have the people to support those posts. So we have a lot of work to do in this area, and we've thrown every incentive and direct hire authority and everything that
Okay.
we can, but we need to go further.
Okay. You and I've previously discussed Jeffrey Epstein. And the chairman knows I've been trying to subpoena his flight logs and Ghislaine Maxwell's Little Black Book. I think it's essential as we look to break apart these sex trafficking rings that not only are here in the U.S., but have grown to be global entities. $150 billion a year business globally, trafficking human beings, primarily women and girls. So while Epstein was in BOP's custody, did you ever have access to his unredacted flight logs or to Ghislaine Maxwell's Little Black Book?
So as a former victims advocate, I know that you and I share values around combating sex trafficking. The Epstein situation happened before my tenure at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, so I was not a part of any of that evaluation and would turn to the Inspector General for any of those questions.
Okay.
Senator, I don't know the answer as I sit here. We can certainly make an inquiry.
I would like to have that answer in writing, if you will.
Yeah,
That would be
we'll
great.
ask the BOP. Obviously, we don't have
Right.
the information you're looking for. We'd have to
Absolutely.
ask the BOP.
I appreciate that, but I would like a response in writing. I also, Director Peters, there is, we have heard that BOP is helping to transport migrants from the southern border into the country, and the Bureau has confirmed that it has provided transportation for migrants since CBP has been inundated with the surge at the southern border. And we've talked before about the extensive staffing challenges at BOP and the negative consequences that come with that. So are you comfortable with having to dedicate your resources that are already stressed to alleviate President Biden's border surge?
So as a fellow law enforcement agency inside the department, we, of course, supporting other components in helping with crisis. It's one of the things that we do well.
Let me ask you this. My time's about to run out. Have you ever transported an individual who was on the terrorist watch list?
Senator, I don't know the answer to that
Could you
question.
look into that and respond in writing?
I will have my team look into it, and we'll get back to you with information that's available.
Excellent. And my time is up, but as always, I'm going to mention the Memphis facility. And you and I have such an ongoing conversation around that. And I do look forward to getting an update on that from you.
Thank you, Senator. I did
Thank you.
check this morning, and it looks like the timelines that we have provided the last time we checked are on target.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms.